Presentation this afternoon is by Wayne Simner, and Wayne is a former head teacher of this parish, and Wayne and I met at many meetings when I first started working at BEP, and Wayne left his headship to go and work as an HMI for Ofsted, and we're delighted that he's with us this afternoon. We are asking people by all means to put questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. If you put it in the Q&A box, then that way I'll make sure they're picked up by Wayne. Just so that you know, Wayne will answer more generic questions. If you ask things like, you know, in our year four in November autumn term, we want to do this, that and that, is that okay? That's a bit too specific. So the more general you can make the questions, the more helpful it will be to everyone. Like I say, if we're expecting about over 150. Wayne's presentation is about 35 minutes, and then we'll move over into questions. Sometimes you might find he's answered the question that you type. By the time you get to the end, he's actually answered it for you. And I'll try and pick that up when I manage the question and answer session at the end. And before I finally hand over to Wayne, the prize of a basket of groceries goes to Colmore Infant School, who have the largest number of attendees that we've seen on the list in many a year from one particular school. So well done, the Colmore Brigade. And Wayne, it's over to you, and thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Tracy, can I just check, can you hear me okay? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. As Tracy's mentioned, for 10 years, I was a head teacher in Birmingham. So it's really, really good to be back with you, even though it's virtually. What I'm going to try and do today is cover quite a lot of ground. Most of it will be around the curriculum, but I will also, towards the end, talk a little bit about reading, building on the work that Kirsty did with you to do with early reading. Because I am going to try and cover quite a lot of ground, I probably won't be able to go into the depth that I normally would, but hopefully we'll give you, we'll cover lots of bases this afternoon. There are limitations of doing this virtually. One is I'm actually just staring at a blank screen, and I'm hoping that you can hear me throughout. And also, when I do training normally, I prefer to have more discussion and more sort of to and fro. So that is another limitation of what we're doing today. It is about 35 minutes, as Tracy has said. And just to share with you, really, a lot of the stuff that we do with Ofsted now, in fact, all of it is based on research. I remember when I was a head teacher, I didn't actually spend that long reading research, but I know, speaking to head teachers over the last couple of years, research is really informing a lot of what we do in schools. One thing just to share with you from the outset, there is no such thing as an Ofsted curriculum. And just to share that with you, because I think there's this view out there in settings that Ofsted have a preferred style for curriculum, but that's not the case at all. And I won't be telling you how to construct your curriculum, because there is actually no set way to do it. But hopefully the things that I share with you this afternoon will guide your thinking. As Tracy said, there will be opportunities for questions at the end, and I will do the best I can to answer them. And I've just taken my watch off so I can keep an eye on the time. So hopefully I won't go over the 35 minutes. Okay. Now I'm just trying to move my slides on with not very much success. So just bear with me a second, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to try and share again. Bear with me, everyone. Sorry about this. Just give me a second, everyone. I'll just go back to the beginning. Sorry about this, Tracy.
No problem at all, Wayne. Absolutely none.
I'm just going to go and do what I did before and take it off, and then I'm going to try and share again. So I do apologise. It was all going so well. Okay. So let's try and share again. Just bear with me. Apologies, everyone. Just going to go and try and do it from the beginning, and hopefully we will be there. Yes, has that moved to a man who's looking very puzzled?
Yes.
Yeah, so that was me. So apologies, everyone. It was all going so well. So to begin with, what I'd like you to do is really just ask yourself this question. How confident, how happy are you with your curriculum? And I want you to think about the areas of strength. And I also want you to think about any areas that you want to improve. And I'm just going to give you a few seconds just to ponder. Think about your curriculum. It may be based around subjects that you're happier with, subjects you're not as happy with. It may be based around other things. But what I would suggest is we're probably all at very different stages with our curriculums. Some schools are further ahead. Some schools have more work to do. And what I want to do today with you is I want to loosen the soil a little bit. I want you to stop. I want you to ponder. And I do want you to think about your curriculum and where you are with it now. So in terms of the curriculum, we hear this term quite a lot, the broad and balanced curriculum. And I think many of us have become a little over familiar with this term. It just rolls off the tongue. You know, we talk about a broad and balanced curriculum. But do remember there are two adjectives in that statement. We're talking about a curriculum being broad. So we are talking about, does it cover those range of subjects? Are the pupils in your school getting the full range of subjects? And then we're talking about balanced. Now, I think we're all aware that some subjects, especially the core subjects, especially English and mathematics, they will take up more curriculum time than the foundation subjects. But do your foundation subjects, do they get the balance they deserve? And if you think about those foundation subjects, history, geography, PE, music, and so on, are some of them the poor relation? So just ponder about your curriculum. One, is it broad? And two, is it balanced? Now, in terms of curriculum itself, what does Ofsted say about curriculum? Well, these quotes are from the framework, and I'll just give you a few seconds just to read what's on the screen. Now, the first thing I'd like you to notice is it talks about knowledge and skills. And a little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to discuss with you what is the difference between knowledge and skills. I also want you to notice it talks about a deep body of knowledge. Research tells us that when we're teaching pupils, we need to give them that deep body of knowledge. It's no good skating over lots and lots of different areas because none of it will be embedded and none of it will be learned. And also thinking about those endpoints. I do think it's important that as leaders and as teachers, we know what we're aiming for in a subject at the end of the term, at the end of the year, at the end of the phase. But I'd also say allow those endpoints to guide your curricular thinking, but don't let them narrow your curriculum. So you become so obsessed by the endpoints that you lose that breadth and that depth in the curriculum. Now, the next two slides are quite wordy, and I do apologise, and you'll notice the rest of my slides are anything but wordy. So two wordy slides to come up. So let's see what the handbook, the Ofsted handbook, section 5 handbook has to say. So I'll give you a few seconds to read these. I suppose the points I want to pick out from those is about please do keep your curriculum for as broad as possible for as long as possible. Don't narrow that curriculum, because when you narrow down those educational experiences, the group of pupils who will suffer most are those pupils who are disadvantaged. And I think we all know the pupils in school, and especially those pupils who are disadvantaged, they get a range of experiences in school that if as leaders and teachers, we don't provide them with those experiences, no one else will. Also, and again, I'm going to come on to this a bit later, a broad and balanced curriculum will support English and mathematics in your schools. They're not mutually exclusive. And again, I'll come on to this a little bit later on, because I think possibly more historically than in the present, some schools were spending more and more time on English and maths, but actually by reducing and narrowing the rest of the curriculum, that can itself have a negative impact on English and mathematics. And again, thinking about testing, do have an awareness of testing, but make sure it's proportionate. Don't let testing become the thing that drives your curriculum. And one more wordy slide. So I'll just give you a few seconds to read this. And again, just a few things to pick out from this slide, and that's about a curriculum. It needs to be well planned. It needs to be clearly mapped out. You don't want your curriculum to be jumbled. You don't want it to be splattergun. You want it to be well sequenced. And once again, I'm going to come on to sequencing a little bit later on. It mentions the national curriculum, and I think if I were to ask you 2 or 3 years ago, when the last time you looked at the national curriculum, for many of us, we'd probably say we don't look at it very often. I do think recently, over the last year or so, maybe longer, leaders and teachers have started going back to the national curriculum. And I think that's important because I think we've lost sight of the national curriculum and we need to go back to it. And one final thing from this slide is curriculum enrichment. It shouldn't be a bolt-on to your curriculum. It should underpin your curriculum and be part of it. Please don't ever see it as something that's just a bolt-on. Okay, let's go on to slides which aren't quite so wordy. Now, the reason I put the picture of the car is it's to do with how I try to explain what we mean by curriculum. So I will come back to the car in a second. But to me, a curriculum, that's the journey, that's the roadmap, that's the blueprint the pupils will follow in terms of their learning as they journey through your school. So when they set foot in your early years department to when they leave in year 6, if you're a primary school, that is the curriculum journey. And just to make a point, the early years curriculum is not a separate curriculum to your school. There isn't an early years curriculum and then a year 1 to year 6 curriculum. They should be part of one whole curriculum that flows seamlessly. I use the car analogy because I imagine the car to be a pupil who joins your school. So the pupil joins your school in early years and they will have a framework to their car and they'll have, you know, parts of the bodywork in place, but it will be quite a hollow shell. And as those pupils journey through your school, you'll start to fill that car with knowledge and skills, and you'll start to fill the boot and the glove compartment and the back seats and the front seats. And as time goes on, you will fill that pupil with knowledge and skills. And if they are taught well, hopefully, most of them will stay within the pupil. They'll stay within the car. They won't seep out through the windows or through a gap in the bottom of the door. So that's my analogy, but I'm sure you can think of much more creative ones yourself. Now, in terms of curriculum and teaching, they are separate, but of course they're linked at the same time. And when we're talking about the curriculum, we're talking about what is taught. When we're talking about pedagogy, we're talking about the teaching activities. How do you deliver that curriculum? But they are dovetailed, they are intertwined. Please don't see the curriculum as one entity and teaching and learning or pedagogy as another. They are joined, they are interlinked. Now, the next question is quite a profound question. And it says, what are the building blocks for a curriculum? Now, I'm going to time myself on my watch, and I want you, if you've got a piece of paper or if you're by yourself, you can talk out loud to yourself. And I know it's putting you on the spot a little bit, but at least we're not in a big room together, so I can't pick anyone to ask a question. What do you think are the building blocks for an effective curriculum? And I'm going to give you a minute starting now. And as any good primary teacher would let you know, you are halfway through your time. Okay, everyone. So in terms of the building blocks, now the next slide I share with you, my answers may be quite simple. Doesn't mean that if you've got something different, it's wrong, but this is the way I'm going to take the presentation. So you may have considered scope. Now, by scope, I mean coverage, so coverage of the curriculum. So your curriculum needs to have appropriate coverage, appropriate scope. And it needs to be well sequenced. And again, I will come back to sequencing a bit later. And I've put down that an effective curriculum needs to build knowledge over time. And it needs to be clearly mapped out. It needs to build skills over time, which need to be clearly mapped out. And it needs to build that vocabulary over time. And this will tie in with what I'll speak to you a little bit later about reading. Now, obviously, I've listed those as 3 separate bullet points, but obviously they're all very much interconnected. So I suppose the question, because we hear a lot about knowledge at the moment, why is building knowledge so important? And I'm going to try and explain quite a complex concept to you. Some of you may already be aware of this, but I'm going to try and do it quite simply in a way because that helps me to understand, because I understand things in a simple manner. So in terms of knowledge, now research tells us that when we learn something new, when we're exposed to a new form of learning, a new piece of knowledge, the way we make sense of that new learning is by connecting it to what we already know. So we understand new knowledge by using prior knowledge to help us make sense of it. And I often call that sticky learning, that you've got some knowledge in your head and that helps you to learn new knowledge for it all to come together. And that's why it's so important that with the curriculum, we're constantly revising, going back over stuff, but slowly moving on at the same time. I see it as a cyclical thing, that we start learning and we reactivate previous learning and then move on to new learning. And it says there, the more you know, the more you can learn. And the next slide will make that a bit clearer as well. Well, the slide afterwards. And do remember as well that knowledge can be transferred between contexts as it builds. I often think about the concept of invasion. Now, when pupils start primary school, that concept of invasion is quite a complicated concept. Now, when the pupils start in early years, they'll probably hear stories about kingdoms being invaded. And that will be how they're first introduced to what invasion and being invaded means. As they then go through the school in history lessons, possibly with Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, they'll learn more about invasion, and they will connect their new learning to the learning they've learned in the past. They'll learn about invasion from historical sources, as it can be a positive thing, but it can also be a negative thing. They may then in PE lessons learn about invasion games. And again, what they already know about the concept of invasion, they will build on that to help them understand what that means. And the final example I could think of, I'm sure you can think of more, in PSHE, they may talk about invasion of personal space. And again, children's knowledge is building up and they're making those connections between what we mean by invasion. And children will do that in all of the subjects and all of our areas before, whether you're talking about mathematics or science, and obviously across subjects. And what I'm trying to say is the more we learn about invasion, it makes it easier to learn even more. As knowledge increases, more connections are made and knowledge deepens. Now, this slide, it's quite a sort of a technical slide, but if you look at the slide on the left, the dots represent pieces of knowledge. And in some ways, that's inside a child's brain or an adult's brain for that matter. And the more you know, the more connections you will make between learning, as you're learning, sorry. Now, on your left, that's called a schema. Some of you may have heard this term, or schemata. And that's the schema of a child who would achieve a lower academic outcome, because their dots, their amount of knowledge is quite limited, so they struggle to make connections. On the right, that would be a pupil who achieves a higher outcome. Because they have greater knowledge, they can make greater connections. And so I suppose what we're saying is we learn new knowledge by making connections to what we already know. So the more we know, the easier it is to learn new knowledge. Now, when I talk about component knowledge, that's about those individual pieces of knowledge. We may have composite knowledge, which is very general, and that's made up of lots of small parts of component knowledge. That component knowledge helps us to build up the bigger picture. And I'll explain why there's a man or a woman panning for gold in just a second. Now, when the question I ask lots of leaders is, if I were to look at your curriculum plans, does it identify that key knowledge, that crucial knowledge, that essential knowledge, the gold nuggets, as I call them? You may call them pearls of wisdom, or, you know, whatever you want to do them. But do those curriculum plans make it clear what the essential knowledge is? Now, I think as leaders and teachers, we do this very well in maths. For example, in a curriculum plan, in maths, it may say calculate the missing angles in a triangle, or add two fractions with a different denominator. And the component knowledge is very clear, very specific, so the teacher knows exactly what to teach as it's mapped out. And my challenge to you, do we have that level of clarity in the foundation subjects? Sometimes I may look at a geography curriculum plan and it may say, use an atlas with confidence. And my first question is, what does that mean? And leaders may then give me lots of examples. It may be to identify capital cities in European countries. So that's what needs to be in your curriculum plan. It needs to be clear. It needs to be specific, just like it is in maths. Sometimes in history, I look at the component knowledge and it says to develop chronology. Again, what does that mean to develop chronology? That's a massive topic and it's open to as many interpretations as there are people who are looking at it. Be specific. To order 5 events in a historical period in chronological order. Be specific, and then you can see that sequencing in the curriculum. Now, I'm not going to speak about assessment today, but in terms of, in order to assess effectively, what do we need to be clear about? And what we need to be clear about is the slide we had before, that component knowledge. Because when you're assessing a pupil, and I don't mean you automatically using a test, it may just be what's going on in the classroom. If you've got a clear piece of knowledge you're assessing, i.e. calculate missing angles in a triangle, it's very clear to check if a pupil knows that. But if your component knowledge is to use an atlas with confidence, how on earth can you assess that? So my plea to you is, in your curriculum plans, are they as clear in your foundation subjects as they are in maths and English? But obviously, going back to balance, you'll spend less time on the foundation subjects, so we wouldn't expect to see so much component knowledge in there. Talking about sequencing, again, I think over the last couple of years, this is something that's been, talked about a lot in schools and a lot, across schools. And this is an analogy that I use. I often think about sequencing. We are building on what went before, and we are creating readiness for the next step. And you probably notice I'm fond of the car analogy, but I think of that pupil in the car. They need to be looking in the rear view mirror, so they need to have understood and have an awareness of what they've learned in the past. They need an awareness of what's coming in the future, and that will help them to learn in the present. I always say to leaders, don't make it difficult for your children. When you plan your curriculums, make sure it's clear, it's sequential, it's building on. Don't have the pupil moving on to something really challenging that's too challenging, and then further down the line they go onto a piece of work that's easier. Think about make life easier for the pupils in your school and make sure those curriculum is well sequenced. Now, you may be surprised to see this next slide. At least I'm moving away from cars, and this is my box set analogy. Well, it's not mine. A gentleman called Neil Almond, he writes a blog, and he used the line of duty to talk about curriculum. Now, I was personally a latecomer to Line of Duty, but I have watched it all. It's something that I did during the lockdown. But for those of you who don't know, there are 6 seasons in Line of Duty, and within each season, there are a number of episodes. Now, I think if you'd never seen an episode of Line of Duty, but maybe you watched season 2, episode 4, and you just watched one episode in isolation, you'd probably enjoy the episode, but you'd be very confused about what's going on. You'd probably be thinking, I'm not sure why that character's done that. That character said this, but I don't really know what the meaning of it is. You may start to make some connections. You may think, oh, something's gone on in the past because of what's happened there. But your understanding of that episode will be quite limited. If you were to watch an entire season, just one season, maybe you chose season 4, you would be able to follow the plot within the season. But there'd be these underlying themes that you wouldn't understand. Those of you who've watched the series might think, who is H? You'd be thinking, why do people keep talking about H? But because you've only watched the one season, you don't get the full picture. So the best thing to do, if time allows, is to start on season 1, episode 1, and follow it through to season 6 and the final episode. And that's a bit like a pupil with their learning. If they're experiencing lessons that are isolated and disconnected, they can't connect that to what they've learned before. So it's important the lessons build on and build towards the next lesson. Thinking about the idea of watching one season, that could be, for example, in a school, year 4 may be absolutely phenomenal, but maybe year 3 isn't as well sequenced, and neither is year 5. So again, that year 4 isn't building on what it needs to, and it's not building towards. So the ideal scenario is when the curriculum is well mapped across all year groups. Now, in terms of knowledge and skills, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and the question is, what is the difference between knowledge and skills? And if I'm honest, I don't know if I have the complete answer for you. But lots of leaders, when I've spoken to them, speak to me about the skill of using a ruler. I am holding up a ruler. I don't know if you can even see it, but this is a ruler that children will use to measure length. Now, lots of leaders speak to me, they talk about, a child's skill at being able to use a ruler. When I think about using a ruler, I think that pupil needs to know that you start at the end of the ruler and not at the zero. They need to know what these demarcations represent along the top, that they are centimetres on one side and millimetres on the other side. If we want them to convert between millimetres and centimetres, they need to know there are 10 millimetres in a centimetre, and they need to know how to multiply and divide by 10. And you probably notice I've used the term know quite a lot. So my question is it a skill of using a ruler, or is it a combination of lots of knowledge? Now, I'm not sure what the answer is. Lots of people suggest that a skill is actually when a pupil or an adult combines all their knowledge and brings them together to do something. But one thing I am sure about is knowledge and skills are not separate. They go side by side and they complement each other. So we need to teach knowledge and we need to teach skills. I've been in some schools that have had it, and they called it a skills-based curriculum. And when I've had this conversation with them, they've said to me, so do we call it a knowledge-based curriculum? And my answer is just call it a curriculum. It's a curriculum that builds knowledge and skills over time. Now, we talked about that a good curriculum will help pupils to make progress. And I think we've all seen this statement of progress means knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. And it says that if a pupil learns something, it's an alteration in their long-term memory. If nothing is altered in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. And that's why we need this constant reinforcement and building on. Now, when I speak to pupils in school, if I said to a pupil, what did you learn on the 19th of March in history? I wouldn't expect them to remember unless they could have a look in their book. But if they told me that in the previous term they'd done a topic on ancient Greeks and they'd done it for the entire term, I would expect them to remember that essential knowledge, those gold nuggets. I would expect that learning to be memorable because it should have gone into their long-term memory if they've learned it well. I don't want to say too much about the 3 I's, about the curriculum. They come under the quality of education judgment. But I do want to share with you the next screen. And this isn't an Ofsted screen. This is a Wayne Simner screen. This is how I remember the 3 I's. When I talk about intent, what do you want the children to learn? When I talk about implementation, how will they learn it? And when I talk about impact, I'm talking about what do they know that they didn't know before. Okay, I'm going to move on to reading. I know I've raced through that work on curriculum. I would normally do it in more depth and a lot slower, but I am conscious of time. But thinking about reading, I think everyone knows that reading needs to be at the heart of the primary curriculum. In fact, it needs to be at the heart of the secondary curriculum, especially for those pupils in the early stages of reading. And the reason it needs to be that is because we learn to read so that we can read to learn. Now, I don't know any person who works in education who would disagree with the importance of reading and the fact it should be a priority. But then the next slide I'm going to share with you, I do find the information quite upsetting. And this is some very recent information. 1 in 4 pupils leave primary school excuse me, unable to read well. 2 in 5 disadvantaged pupils leave primary school unable to read well. I know this is obvious, but 2/5 is almost 1/2. So almost 1/2 of our primary school pupils are leaving school unable to read if they are disadvantaged. And I think when we think about schooling later on, if a pupil struggles to read, as they get older, they start to become very embarrassed. They try to hide it. They try to find avoidance. They may start to be disruptive. That can then lead to more behaviour problems. You know, with some pupils, that could lead to exclusion if it gets to that extent. And I'm not sure of the exact figure, but I know a couple of years ago, there's a very, very high percentage of people in prison who cannot read. And so I think one of the greatest things we can do for pupils is to make sure that reading is at the heart of our curriculum. Now, the next slide, this is what Kirsty may have shared with you, those of you who did early reading. And I'm not going to talk too much about this slide, but just to remind you that word recognition, along with language comprehension, means that pupils will read with understanding. And this is where I want to bring it back to the curriculum. One of the greatest ways that we can develop pupils' language comprehension, their knowledge of language, their knowledge of vocabulary, is through other curriculum areas, through the humanities, through history, geography, through the sciences, through the arts. Because when we teach these subjects, we expose pupils to that range of language, that range of knowledge. So if we narrow our curriculum, if we narrow it in terms of the humanities, the sciences and the arts, we are actually causing a negative impact on pupils' language comprehension. Some of you may remember, many of you are probably not as old as I am, but going back quite a few years, there was a Key Stage 2 reading comprehension paper, and it talked about polar regions, it talked about evaporation, it talked about climate. And I remember having conversations with people saying, well, our pupils didn't know what climate and evaporation and polar regions meant, but actually they are in the national curriculum. So if we do teach a broad and balanced curriculum, we will expose pupils to that language, which will help them with their reading. Now, I'm not going to talk about deep dives because I'm sure you've all heard about deep dives before, but just a few sorts of bullet points there to remind you about deep dives, because I know people often ask me about this. And for a Section 5 inspection, just to notice, a deep dive, reading will always be a deep dive in a primary school, and deep dives must include at least one foundation subject. So, quick question for you. If I were to ring your school tomorrow and tell you I was conducting a Section 5 inspection of your school on Thursday and Friday this week, which I won't be, which 2 subjects would you be hoping that I wouldn't be picking? And it's probably the 2 subjects that maybe you feel aren't as well established, subjects you haven't got round to developing at the moment. And what I would say to you is just remember, with your curriculum, Rome wasn't built in a day. If you try to do everything all at once, it will probably come crashing down. So I think it's important that when you're looking at your curriculum, you plan it and you do it strategically. So you develop that curriculum over time and you take your staff with you. Get those fundamentals right from the beginning and then build your curriculum. But do remember those 2 subjects that you've possibly just thought about that you wouldn't want me to inspect. That probably means that the pupils in your school are not getting the best start to their education in those 2 subject areas. Some essential documents: the School Inspection Handbook, that tells you all about how we inspect schools. This is the Section 5 handbook. There's obviously the Section 8 as well. And that's a public document. You know, there's nothing secret about it. And can I urge you to go back to the national curriculum? In terms of takeaway points, I'd just like you to ponder for a second and just think to yourself, from what you've heard today, if you had to take something away that you held on to, because I know I have jumped around quite a lot, what would that be? I think my takeaway point is about those golden nuggets, that essential knowledge. Do you make sure in your curriculum plans that component knowledge is very clear in history and geography, in all of your subjects, and make sure it is building as time goes on. Just to let you know, this is all the information I know at the moment, Tracy, but on the 15th of July, there's going to be some curriculum roadshows organised by Ofsted, and hopefully more information will be to follow. And just to say, thank you again for inviting me today. I'm not going anywhere. I am going to be here for any questions, but I didn't just want to suddenly end without saying thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me the time to be back virtually in Birmingham, because that was 10 years as a head, which I really, really enjoyed. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing now, Tracy, and then I'm going to hand over to yourself. I hope that was useful. Thank you, everyone.
Wayne, thank you so much. I just loved that. And I really liked, you know, I know you kept saying I'm making it simple, but I really liked the simplicity of it. I thought the messages were really clear. I've got one question that I thought it was particularly around your concept thing around the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're planning out your sequence, would you expect key concepts like that to be identified in the plan as well? So not only is it the knowledge, but also the concepts?
Not really, Tracy. I think what I was trying to make with that point is that it's this idea of schema and schemata, and you know, and children learn more by knowing more. And I think when you actually stop and think about it, there's concepts such as invasion, there's concepts such as empire, you know, which actually span different subjects. So I'm not saying at all that you've got to, you know, color code them and show where they are in subjects, but hopefully things like invasion, those sorts of topics which sort of transcend different subjects, they will be seen in different curriculum plans. But no one would be expecting leaders to say we've color coded every mention of invasion in this color. You know, I'm not expecting that at all, and neither are Ofsted, if that makes sense.
And in the national curriculum, it's been a long time since I've looked at it, I'm very ashamed to say. Are the concepts really clear for the foundation subjects as well as the knowledge?
I mean, I suppose what I would say is it's this idea, it's a bit like knowledge and skills, isn't it? What's the difference between a concept and knowledge? Knowledge is what builds into a concept, isn't it? What I would say in the national curriculum, I think you all know this, they're very prescriptive in the core subjects. In the foundation subjects, they are quite general, but there is really useful information in there that will help you with your curriculum planning. And just to sort of say, don't get sidetracked by that idea of a concept. Really, the key things are about the knowledge and the skills, and they will actually weave into lots of different concepts over time.
Great, thank you. So I've got some questions here which I'm going to start reading to you. Forgive me, everybody, for peering at you, but the font is so small that if I don't sit on top of the camera, I can't read it. One question: should schools be writing intent statements for each national curriculum subject, or should it be a whole school intent document? Would that be enough?
I think it's for the school to decide. I think, first of all, what I would suggest to school leaders is ask yourself, what is your intent, first of all? You know, what actually is your intent? And I think it was Sean Harford in a blog said a while back, We don't expect schools to have an intent, an implementation, an impact statement. Lots of schools have chosen to do that, which is absolutely fine, but there's no expectation that you do. What we're talking about is when we meet with curriculum leaders as part of our deep dives, we will be asking them about their individual subjects. Very often when we speak to the head teacher on the telephone, there may be a more general intent across the school. It could be a very generic one, you know, that we want to provide children with the knowledge and skills to support them to become active citizens in the future. But then obviously that's the so what question, isn't it? So how are you going to do that? But there's no requirement for people to be doing, you know, I call it the 3 I's, these statements. Lots of schools do, and I understand why they do, because it is what we want them to know. This is how they're going to learn it, and this is how we'll know they remember it. But it's up to a school to decide what is best for the children in their school.
Thank you. Mike Smart has asked, if some subjects are more of a work in progress than others, and we all know what he means, to what extent does Ofsted accept that?
I think what I would say to Tracy and to Mike is, when we do the deep dives, and I know I didn't speak about deep dives in too much detail, we always have to look at early reading, and then we probably look at mathematics or maybe English. And then we often look at 2 foundation subjects, and it tends to be one subject that the school have been working on, and then it may be a subject that they may not feel is as well established. And I think in some ways it's a hard question to answer, because it's about the extent, isn't it? And it's about the extent that schools are working on those different subjects. But I think we're all aware there are the transition statements in the Ofsted handbook that refer only to the intent aspects, and they don't apply to the core subjects and our English, maths and science. But I think we're all aware that schools are at different stages with their curriculum. And I think it's about demonstrating what you do and what you plan to do next, but also it will be different because every school will be at a different stage. So that discussion will happen, but I suppose it's the extent to how many subjects are a work in progress, as it were.
Great, thank you. And a question that hasn't been asked here, but actually was something that was put to me today. And now that we've the ruling on outstanding schools has changed, and over a certain length of time will definitely be a Section 5. One of the head teachers I was speaking to this morning asked me about, so what does the above and beyond look like when it comes to extensive personal development? You know, I mean, she and I were discussing around their fantastic offer around arts and PE, but what does this beyond the expected? What are people looking for from that?
I mean, I think it's hard to say exactly what's being looked for. I think with outstanding, the first thing to remember is the good criteria needs to be secure, and the entire good criteria needs to be very secure. And then you look onto the outstanding bullet points, and really, without having the handbook in front of me, it's about it being exemplary, isn't it? And what I would say is there are schools in Birmingham that underneath the new framework are outstanding schools. So it is something that is achievable, it is something that is attainable, but it would be hard to say exactly what that looks like without being in a school and having a handbook in front of me. But the first thing, remember, first of all, the good criteria needs to be securely met in all areas. And I know I've probably not answered your question very well, Tracy, so it's hard not being in the school.
You're right, and you know, Wayne, I'm in the really fortunate position is I go into some of those schools. In fact, I know I've looked at who's on this call today, and I know just how many meet that kind of criteria for the above and beyond that they do, which is fabulous to see. Yeah. Nicola has asked, our primary school is surrounded by evidence of historical events, both local and national. how much of that should be delivered?
In terms, are you talking about the history curriculum or?
I'm assuming that that's what Nicola means. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the national curriculum history, it does talk about, doesn't it, about a local history study. So that's obviously an important way. But I think as well, it's about that is the curriculum for the pupils in your school. So if your school has a name for a historical reason, I'm sure that you would want them to know why. Learn about the local history. And I think what you will find is you can weave that into your curriculum, and it doesn't need to be a bolt on. It can be part of your curriculum. So when you're thinking about your history, with your geography, with the English activities that you do, I think it's it's there waiting to be discovered, isn't it? So why not use it within your curriculum?
Thanks, Wayne. Nicola, I hope that helps a little bit. By all means, put anything in to follow up on that if you want me to pick up on that with Wayne in a minute. Jess has asked about what are the expectations from Ofsted in terms of assessing foundation subjects?
I mean, what I would say to you, Tracy, is lots of leaders ask me this, what do we expect to see? And it's in terms of, are you talking, there's assessment for learning, isn't there? And we do assessment for learning every single second of every single day. And then we do the assessment of learning, and we're trying to discover, have pupils remembered the things that we've taught them? Now, how a school chooses to do that is entirely their choice. It's not our place to tell you how to do it, and there is no preferred style. And so a school has to make that. And I've been in lots of different schools, and schools do it in lots of different ways. I suppose one of the things you can do with BEP is if schools have got things that they think they're really proud of, maybe that can be shared between schools. But what I would say is there isn't a set way to do it. So don't think if a school does it that way and maybe they've had some good feedback, everyone thinks this is the way to do it. But I suppose it's going back to what do we mean by assessment? And possibly if there was more time today, we could have spent more time looking at assessment. But there's definitely not an expectation that we expect to see it in any particular way. But when I do speak to pupils, I would expect them to remember that essential knowledge. And if it's been taught and assessed well, they will be able to remember it.
So just give me an example of what that might look like, Wayne. So say I put down that they will know, I don't know, the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Is that exactly what you would go and ask them? And would you ask them straight after they've done that? Or if they did that in autumn, might you be asking them that in summer?
It's probably a bit of both, Tracy. And I mean, I wouldn't sort of have a list of questions that I would be quizzing those pupils on about the Tudors. But if, for example, they'd done a topic on the Tudors, and maybe, where are we now? We're in June, and maybe they did it in the spring or even the autumn term. And I was doing a deep dive in history, and they said, we did about Tudors in the autumn term. And I would say, well, can you tell me what you can remember about the Tudors? And if the children said to me, I can't remember anything about it at all, what I then often do is they may then look in their books and so on. So I wouldn't be expecting them to tell me every single thing they've learned in the Tudors, but I would expect them to know that the king was called Henry VIII. I would, basically I'd be looking at the curriculum plans. What is the school intended to teach them? And I would expect the pupils to remember some of that. It's a bit like with maths. They may learn the 2s, 5s and 10s early in Key Stage 1. And we don't expect them to forget those times tables, do we?
No.
We'd expect them to remember them. But so it's about that balance. But I would be expecting pupils to remember some of the things they did. Thinking about that slide about progress, learning is a change in your long-term memory. But I wouldn't be expecting, I wouldn't be going down to specific dates and how many, so it would be in an age appropriate way as well. If a pupils had done a topic about rivers, I would expect them to remember, you know, possibly about what's a meander, what's a river source. You know, if they said we've done a topic on rivers, but I can't remember anything about it whatsoever, we obviously wouldn't base that on one pupil. We'd speak to different pupils. But I would expect pupils to remember some of the things that they've learned.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I mean, one of my favourite ones was always, you know, when children said they'd been learning about the Victorians, and I always said, why are the Victorians called the Victorians? And I can't tell you how often they couldn't actually tell you.
Yeah.
Which is always quite fascinating.
Yeah.
A quick plug here. We talked about Kirsty Godfrey and her brilliant early reading session that is coming through Little Sutton English Hub. Kirsty is doing it again on the 24th of June, so that's later this week, 3:45 to 5:15. She's doing deep dives in reading. And the details are on the Little Sutton English website. Anything else in there? What has been learnt so far, and a recording on Wednesday the 30th of June is going to be available as well. One more question,
Yeah.
Wayne.
And can I, Tracy, just double plug Kirsty? Kirsty is, I think she's fantastic. I do have to say, and you know, and if anyone can go to any of her training events, it's, you know, it'll be of real benefit. So.
Yeah, everybody's been wowed with her. And while we're on the subject of plugging next events, we have also got on July the 6th, we have got our SEN Ofsted webinar on what Ofsted are looking for when they look at SEND provision in both mainstream and special. So anybody in the room, keep your eye open for that. That's another free one running at this similar type of time. Final question then, Wayne. Taking on subject leadership, particularly in primary, in foundation subjects, is really quite daunting. Often people are asked to do something and it's not at all their specialism. What advice would you give a brand new subject leader? What would you suggest for them?
I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think what I, you know, if someone has been appointed as the history leader with no pre-experience, I think the first thing I would say to them is speak to your head teacher and see what training is available for you, or if you're within a multi-academy trust, or, you know, is there support available within the trust. So first of all, do get training for yourself, one about curriculum leadership, but then also that subject specific leadership. And then also, you know, where do they get that support from in school as well? They may get support from senior leaders, but it is daunting. And what I often think is you've got a teacher in year 6 who teaches all subjects, and when children 6 weeks later go to secondary school, they're taught by specialist teachers. But I suppose my key thing really, I would say for any curriculum leaders, the first question I ask them is, what training have you had? Because obviously if they're being given a responsibility in school, we would expect them to have some form of training if they need it. So I suppose my piece of advice is get as much training and support as you can.
Great, thank you. Just to tell you that Nicola, who asked the question about the local history, she says it definitely answered her question, thank you. And Tracy from Colmore Infants, great that so many of you are here. As an infant and nursery school with a new EYFS curriculum framework to be implemented in September and 2 years of national curriculum before the children move to Key Stage 2, is there anything else they should be considering in preparation for Ofsted? She's thinking keep the endpoints in mind here, but, you know, talking about the new framework as well as the two, what would be your advice about the link between the infant and junior school curriculum?
I suppose it goes back to this sequencing between the infant and the junior. Sorry, I suppose it's about. Do you know the background, Tracy? Does the school have much contact with? Yeah. Is there a local junior school or? Yeah, I suppose the advice is transition, isn't it? Communication between the two schools. So Key Stage 2 know what's coming from Key Stage 1, and Key Stage 1 know what's expected from Key Stage 2. So I suppose my advice is good communication and good transition, and I think that will support both schools.
Brilliant. And then back to I so rudely interrupted you about the sequencing that Tracy asked about. So she asked about the EYFS curriculum framework and the 2 years of national curriculum? Is there anything they should be considering?
I suppose I would just see it as one curriculum. See it as one curriculum. You've got what's going on in early years, you've got what's going on in Key Stage 1. How is your early years preparing children from year 1? But I don't mean speeding children up to get them, make sure they experience that full early years curriculum. And I think under the new framework, it is a lot more specific, isn't it, in early years and in terms of breaking up some of the subjects. And again, I think it's about those conversations between reception and year 1. It's about transition. It's about that communication. So early years is very different to Key Stage 1, but don't think as a school you've got 2 separate curriculums. The early years curriculum should build towards what the children will experience in year 1.
Great. Well, almost bang on time, Wayne. According to my clock, we're just 1 minute after 5 o'clock. Really, absolutely fabulous. I just so appreciated it. I know everybody that has been, listening to you will have learnt loads. Thank you all very much. Just to plug again, don't forget the English Hub and Kirsty, and don't forget the send on July the 6th. When you sign out of this meeting, you will get an automatic evaluation. It would be really great for Wayne and I to get some feedback on how helpful it was and what you could do with knowing next. Because our whole job here is facilitating what you need to help you be as great a school as so many of you are. But anyway, Wayne, thank you very, very much. Thank you to everybody that joined in this afternoon. And if I don't see you before, I'll see you on the 6th of July. But Wayne, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.